All right. Okay, well, thanks for inviting me. And yeah, Aladdin was kind enough to uh, ask me if I wanted to or if I was able to contribute. And so I'm very happy to. Um, so I'll just start by introducing myself briefly. So I'm a historian. I work at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. And what I focus on is the history of health and medicine. And this morning, I'm going to turn to history to discuss some of the ways in which we can transform our society, not only to be kinder as society, but also provide us as individuals the freedom to be kinder ourselves. And one of the subjects that has interested me a lot in recent years is the history of preventing mental illness. So, for much of human history, we've actually put a lot of effort into preventing mental illness in various ways. For a long time, this may have included religious approaches, since madness might have been thought of being a curse from the gods or the devil. For 2,000 years or more, we also had humoral medicine, which was very much a preventive approach. So the word melancholia, which was a word that used to describe what we might describe as depression now, melancholy came from the word black bile. The human body had four different humors that always had to be in balance with one another: black bile, blood, yellow bile, and phlegm. And melancholia was caused by too much black bile. One way you could prevent that was by adjusting your diet and your lifestyle in ways to make sure that that black bile stayed in check. And then in the 19th century, we have all sorts of interesting, let's say, approaches to preventing mental illness, some of which we are very sensible and we probably need to think more about, and then others might not be so sensible. So one thing that was very popular in the 19th century was preventing masturbation, because masturbation was thought to drive you completely insane. But also things like overstudy. So making children study too much was thought to be bad for mental health. And as someone who works in a university, I do wonder if perhaps we could learn something from that. We also had there are also conditions such as neurasthenia, which was a nervous condition that emerged in the late 19th century that was associated with living in uh, urban environments where there were telegraphs, trains, trams, all sorts of commotion, and it was thought that the nerves of especially middle class people couldn't cope. And the cure for that was often going and spending time in the countryside. And there were also biological causes as well. So pellagra is probably the most interesting. Pellagra is a vitamin deficiency disease, and it's caused often when agriculture shifts to corn, which doesn't provide the vitamin that's required. And so places in northern or southern Europe and the southern United States that switch to a corn diet, you have thousands of people falling victim to this vitamin deficiency disease, which is completely preventable. So if you went to an asylum in northern Italy, many of the people there would be suffering from pellagra rather than any other cause of their madness. In the 20th century, we start turning more to social conditions. So we see this in the mental hygiene and the child guidance movements. And the Second World War really raises concerns about the prevalence of mental illness. And so what happens after the war is we get this new approach to dealing with mental illness called social psychiatry. And this was an attempt to use both the insights of the social sciences, so sociology, anthropology, and psychiatry to try to figure out once and for all what were the real societal factors that contributed to mental health problems. And there were a series of really fascinating studies that were conducted in the United States in particular that identified some of the prime causes for mental health problems. So one was done in Chicago in the 1930s, and it found that poverty was really a key factor in people ending up in asylums in Chicago during that period. Another study Chicago was quite a new city. Yale was quite an old city for North American standards. It goes back to the 17th century, and it had its really entrenched class system. So the researchers who focused on New Haven determined that it was actually inequality that had was a big factor in contributing to mental illness. And then probably the biggest study, or the biggest study, was in New York. And in New York, focusing on Midtown area of Manhattan, they determined that factors, yes, poverty, inequality, but also things like social exclusion and community disintegration. You could feel very alone in the busiest city in the world. So if you think about these sort of factors and how do you deal with them? Well, if they had been reduced, that would have been a grand act of kindness, wouldn't it? But that wasn't meant to be. The social psychiatrists who investigated these sort of ideas had clearly indicated what needed to be done, but they weren't so good about indicating how to actually do it. So in some way there was a will, but there wasn't a way. And by the 1970s and the 1980s, the interest in social psychiatry and in preventing mental illness really wanes a great deal. There's more of a focus on the individual and individual mental health rather than the mental health of populations. And it's also when we start to see biological psychiatry taking root. So focusing on genetic or neurological explanations for mental illness, and then turning to pharmaceutical products for the solutions. So we see a decline in the interest of prevention, a decline in the interest of social psychiatry. And as we can also tell, the rates of mental illness start to creep up as well. So let's turn to today. Now, I think even before COVID, many would have argued that we are in the midst of a bit of a mental health crisis. And for me, as a historian, I do see some parallels with the period after the Second World War, just in terms of the concern about mental health, as well as the greater willingness to talk about it. One of the, I think, case studies for this is sport. Think about the sport pages or the BBC Sport website 10 years ago, you would never have found any articles of athletes talking about their mental health problems. In the last 2 or 3 years, we've probably had a few hundred articles that focus on the mental health problems of athletes. And that's because the stigma of mental illness is starting to decrease a little bit. We still need to go an awful long way, but it is changing. And I think what's happened as well is that there's a bit more interest in prevention. So how do we actually prevent people from getting mentally ill? And one of the things that has happened has been the emergence of individual techniques such as mindfulness, which are very effective in helping people to put things into perspective and live for the moment and focus on things that perhaps will not make them feel stressful and stressed and upset. But I would argue that we also need to kind of go further and think about deeper societal changes that will help us to prevent mental illness as well. And one of the things that I've turned to in recent years is the idea of universal basic income. So universal basic income, or UBI, is a guaranteed income provided to everyone in society. There's no means testing. It's unconditional. Everyone receives it. They will receive it till they die. And unlike the current benefit system or welfare systems in other parts of the world, there's no fiddling around with it. You get it, and that's all there is. If you go to school, or if you go back to university, you can keep getting it. If you start a new job or want to transfer from one job to another, you'd get it in the midst of that, but you'd keep getting it. It's a constant in your life, this income that's always there. So, I mean, I see UBI as an inherently kind intervention, partly because it would help eliminate some of those factors that social psychiatrists believed to cause much mental illness. So quite obviously, if it was set at a high enough level, which would be the case, it would reduce poverty. And we know that poverty causes the sort of stresses that are often responsible for mental illness. But it would also help to reduce inequality by eliminating some of the stigma associated with benefits. Everyone would get a universal basic income. I would get it, the Queen would get it, and the people really struggling in society would get it too. And I think what that provides people is with a certain amount of hope that they can achieve a better life. I'm up here in Scotland, and one of our former chief medical officers who works at Strathclyde with me now, Sir Harry Burns, talks a lot about diseases of despair. These are diseases, addictions, alcoholism, mental health problems, these sorts of things. And he associates those diseases of despair with the fact that many people in certain parts of Glasgow, but other parts of other cities in the UK and other parts of the world simply don't see a way out. They feel trapped, and because they're trapped, they resort to the sort of destructive behaviors that lead to illness and death often. So in this case, with a UBI, partly because it's universal, it's paid to everybody, but it also, because it's always there for people, it allows people to make the sort of changes so that they can advance in society. And I don't see this as just advancing for the sake of advancement. I see it more in terms of allowing people to pursue the sort of careers that they actually want to pursue. So I used to work as a careers advisor back home in Canada. And it was actually quite depressing sometimes when you talk to people about the sort of jobs that they wanted to do, why they actually wanted to do them. I remember quite a few people wanting to do what Homer Simpson did on The Simpsons because it seemed really easy and simple. And I thought, well, you can do that, but is that really going to make you happy? I think UBI is something that can give people the freedom and the flexibility to pursue the sort of work and careers that will make them happy in the arts, for instance, in music, but also things like returning to full-time schooling, starting their own business. And I think crucially, it also financially recognizes people for the work that goes unpaid in society. Think of all the caring and the parenting that millions do currently for nothing. So recognizing that through a basic income, I think would be really good. But I think finally, and most intriguingly, really, I think a universal basic income would help us to be kinder. It would allow us to be kinder rather than being forced to organize our lives around maintaining an income at the expense of family, community, the environment, and our actual hopes and dreams of what we actually want to do with ourselves. It would help us recalibrate our efforts in life to things that really matter to us. These things, many of us take for granted. And I think COVID, in fact, and lockdown in particular, helped us think a bit more about what really matters to us. For many people, nature emerged as a real salvation for them. Those, I should say, those of us who could access nature. Many people living in the middle of busy cities and council estates that are miles away from any countryside really struggled with that. But for many people who had the ability to, nature was a real salvation. And that tells us a message. Maybe if we realize that nature isn't just something associated with climate change and existential threats to our existence, is actually something positive as well that we can engage with much more in life. Other things, people picked up hobbies perhaps on furlough that they didn't know or didn't have the ability to do before. COVID really put things in perspective for a lot of people, as well as of course, because we weren't able to spend time with friends and family, it's put that into perspective as well. Many of us have realized how important that is. And having structures in society that allows us to engage more with each other and our community is really important. And I think universal basic income would help us think more of society in terms of social and emotional growth rather than merely economic growth. Places like Bhutan, that has a takes the happiness index really seriously, are providing some examples of that. And in Scandinavia as well, the concept of hygge, that feeling of comfort and satisfaction and feeling warm and welcome is really important as well. But we need to make that more central, I think, in terms of how we structure society, rather than just is the GDP increasing or not. We could. I would be very happy with a post-COVID Scotland or UK that maybe didn't have the economic growth, but had much more social and emotional growth. I think that'd be great for all of us. So one of the criticisms of UBI is rooted in the idea that people are selfish and lazy, and if you don't make people to work for something, they'll take advantage of you at pretty much every turn. And if we think historically about this thinking is really rooted, at least in the UK, in the 19th century thinking that fueled the New Poor Law and gave rise to the workhouse that Charles Dickens wrote about in novels such as Oliver Twist. I really think that sort of thinking is still very prevalent in how we think about our relationship to others in society, and that's really unfortunate. I mean, this thinking is almost 170 years old now. We should probably be progressing our thinking a little bit. And to be frank, I think that sort of thinking is rubbish. I don't think that people are essentially governed by laziness and selfishness. And I've long argued, in fact, that compassion and community engagement are just as powerful motivators and indicators of human nature as competition and self-preservation are. If society was structured in a way to allow our inherent kindness to flow through easier, I think we could be much more able to deal with the challenges thrust upon us, ranging from climate change to COVID and lots of other things. UBI, I think, could be a pivotal way to restructure society in ways that privileged kindness over competition. It won't prevent everything. It won't prevent all mental illnesses or solve all of our problems, but I do think it would be a step in the right direction of a kinder way of trying to do so. So I'll stop there. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Wow.
And I suppose I'll try to end hosting.
No, keep it for now, I think, because
Okay.
otherwise your video might disappear.
Right.
There's a couple of questions here, but if I may start with a couple of questions. I love the idea or the concept of a kinder government, actually, just thinking more from a top level. So if a government is, responsible for its citizens and it's thinking, okay, how can we create a happier and kinder society? And then UBI could be one powerful way of helping to facilitate that. I'm just thinking about the so-called happier countries in Scandinavia you mentioned. And I feel that they seem to be closer to UBI than us in a way, in the UK and other countries. Would you agree with that? And do you think, is there any countries or any smaller places that have instituted UBI and it's reduced mental health challenges?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's kind of two parts. I think the first part, in terms of Scandinavia and some other countries like the Netherlands, for example, partly because their welfare systems are a lot more generous and there are fewer I guess it's a more carrot than stick approach. So there's fewer ways in which people can run afoul of the system and lose their benefits. That often, although people there are sympathetic to the idea, there's less of a need for UBI. And also, if you look at things like measures such as inequality, a lot of these places have far less inequality, far less poverty than, say, the UK, Canada, the United States. And so maybe it's not quite as attractive. Where you have seen pilots popping up, there hasn't been any full-scale implementation of basic income. Probably the closest you get is is places like Alaska, where because of the oil revenues, everyone gets $500 every once in a while, but it's certainly not seen in the same way. I come from Alberta, and I remember one year when the oil revenues were really high, the government didn't know what to do with all the money they had, so they just sent everyone a check for $400. Which, I mean, I think I gave mine to the Stephen Lewis Foundation. It was just such a lazy way of of, of figuring things out. And of course, now the oil is not doing so well, and probably the government's wishing they had that $500 or $400 back. So, but where the trials have happened, so in Finland, in Ontario, Stockton, California, for example, mental health is not formally assessed, and that's something I think that should change. I think they should almost mandate that you need to assess it when you're doing a UBI trial, but it comes out. So there was this interesting video that came out after the Finnish experiment, and almost the entire video focused on how people's mental health had improved, how their stress levels had gone down, how they just that weight, that weight. Anyone who's been under financial problems in life or other sorts of insecurities, immigration. I'm an immigrant, and the threat of being kicked out of the country, and with Brexit looming, it's just a weight on your shoulders, and when that weight disappears, it does make it an impact. So that's what starts to emerge from some of these trials. It's not just about are people going back to work or not. It's these other benefits that we need to start thinking about.
Thank you. This is fascinating. There's so many questions here. Maybe I'll read 2 or 3 of them and you can answer which ones.
Sure.
So first one is, how much would UBI be? Next one is, how would we ensure that we give UBI to all? Prices wouldn't just rise so that some are still unable to afford the need. So maybe start with those 2.
Yeah, those are good questions. I think one key thing, I didn't say this in the talk, but many of us who support UBI see it as a foundation or a floor rather than a ceiling. So it's the foundation on which a much better welfare system can take place. So it's not about so in terms of how much, it would be certainly enough to lift people out of poverty, but lift head and shoulders out of poverty. And I think the rationale for that, if people say it's too expensive, well, first of all, the current system is very expensive, and it's also woefully inefficient. I don't know if any of you watched the film I, Daniel Blake. That provides a wonderful example of how the welfare system is just structured to be gatekeepers. So it's structured to prevent people from accessing their benefits rather than giving their benefits. And when I worked in Canada as a youth counselor and a career advisor, 90% of my time was devoted to ensuring that these young people had enough money. It wasn't focusing on their mental health or their career ambitions or their education. It was simply making sure that they managed to do what they needed to do to keep their income. If that wasn't part of the equation, we could allow the people working in the benefit system to actually work to solve the more difficult problems. I mentioned preventing mental illness. One of the great causes of mental illness is child abuse that occurs early on in life, and the trauma that exerts on people. Well, that's really difficult to deal with, but because we're so focused on the financial side of things, we can't get to grips with the really difficult things. So I think that's one of the key issues. And in terms of the inflation, I think rent control would have to be introduced, which again would be a good thing. Places like New York City have had robust rent controls for many, many decades. And things like, I think I would love to, one of the other things I research is the history of food and nutrition, which is another big issue we have in the UK. And I would love to see much more robust food and nutrition policies put in place to ensure that people have access to local healthy food, and they know what to do with it. If it's not like a turnip shows up in your mailbox and you don't know what to do, people are educated to do. I think food should be a core subject in the curriculum all the way through. So, like I said, UBI would be the starting point for really transforming our welfare system, for a welfare system that is for the welfare of all of us, really, not just the the poor, so to speak, for everybody.
Oh, wow. I think we've pretty much run out of time, actually. Maybe we could just very quickly, Claire had a question. She said that Sweden voted against it and it was successfully trialed in Alaska. How do we get past the political and public stigma against the concept of UBI?
Well,
Just a minute or two.
I think there's two ways to do it. Pilots are great, but you can quibble with any scientific trial. I think the two ways, one is stories from individuals talking about how this could help and how it has helped. I think that's really important. And then the other thing is health. I think the potential health outcomes would be putting a negative way, the straw that would break the camel's back in terms of, the resistance. I think that would really make a big difference. And COVID has provided an excellent case study for that. We know that it affects the most disadvantaged people in society the most, and that is costly. We're going to be paying for these costs for a long time. So I see it as a preventive, and that's the way they would pay for itself.
I found this so fascinating. I wish we had more time, actually. Hopefully, maybe in the future, maybe in a few months when we have another slot, we would love to have you back if you have time, and we could learn more about it. And also the nutrition stuff. I'd be fascinated about that. I've always thought that unhealthy, very commercial food should be taxed more, and that money go towards cheaper vegetables and fruit and things like that. So yeah, excellent. Well, thank you. Yeah, so if you could work out how to pass on
so
you need to go to my name and click on participants first.
Participants, okay.
And then click on more next to my name, Shamash.
Okay.
It should have an option there to make host.
More, make host.
Yes.
Yes.
I got the power.
It even says yes. Yes. All right. Oh, I enjoyed that. Thanks for your questions, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Feel free to get in touch with me if you're interested. I'm happy to talk more about this to anybody who's listening right now.
Well, if he has questions, really kind of burning questions, then maybe I'll put a few together and in the future, or send them to you, or maybe check out your books as well. Like
sure.
Or have you got a blog post on this or anything?
Yes, in fact, I'll put a couple in the chat, and people can have a look at those. Okay.
That'd be perfect. Yeah, thank you. Thanks again, Matt. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.